These now are the main areas of fighting in northern Gaza. The shaded areas are where Israeli soldiers and tanks have made advances encircling Gaza City and effectively cutting the strip in half. Israeli troops and tanks have completely surrounded the port of Gaza. It's believed that the armed wing of Hamas, the Qassam brigades, is fighting on what's being described as 4 decisive fronts in Tal Hawa, Al-Shati, Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun. Let's speak to Andreas Krieg about this. He's a senior lecturer in security studies at King's College London, joining us from London. Thank you, Andreas, for being with us. Okay, let's begin with the situation at Al-Shifa first, and this claim by the Israelis and the Americans that Al-Shifa is the command center for Hamas. Is there any tangible evidence of that?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, we're looking at an ongoing operation. Nothing that has been presented by either side as evidence is very tangible or conclusive, and things obviously shift around quite quickly. What has to be said, though, is that the narrative of Al-Shifa Hospital being somewhat the command center of Hamas has been going around for a decade. So Israelis have always pushed that narrative. It's now time of truth where they have boots on the ground, where they now have to come up with evidence that this is actually true. So far, they haven't presented any evidence. And the evidence that the IDF has presented over the last couple of days around different hospitals in Gaza have always not just been inconclusive, but to a great deal have also been inconsistent and showed a lot of flaws and misinformation in it, which also makes it very difficult to really trust their word for it. Right. And from an intelligence point of view as well, I would say that the Americans are just copying what the Israelis are saying instead of actually presenting their own evidence. So there isn't a lot out there.
Right. Even if they came up with evidence, Andreas, evidence like, let's say, a bunker in Al-Shifa Hospital, what would it prove?
It doesn't prove anything per se, and what we've seen, I think the IDF said this morning in Hebrew on the radio that they have not found any evidence for any hostages being there or having been there. So that as well also disproves some of the claims that they've made. What is interesting is, though, that there have been stories around Shifa Hospital already for a while where people have said that there is a bunker system underneath the hospital, not connected to the hospital, that was actually built by the Israelis, and that's what makes the Israelis so certain that there is a bunker system there. I find it highly doubtful that Hamas would still be in that system underneath that hospital, considering that IDF forces have moved so close to the hospital, and if they had been there, would have probably moved out by now. Right. And so, you know, it doesn't really change the protected status of the hospital, and it still means that the burden is both on Hamas and the IDF to make sure that civilians are protected inside the hospital.
Yeah, and as you said, interestingly, the Israelis have admitted there's no information right now about the presence of hostages in Al-Shifa. What does this suggest about their intelligence, or is there something perhaps more cynical going on there?
Well, I think in this operation, more than ever, the Israelis have shown determination to strike as they see fit. They don't double and triple check that as they might have done in previous operations. They certainly have been a lot more lax with the application of international humanitarian law in comparison to other Western countries or liberal democracies in their application of force. I'm not saying that they're doing it without intelligence, but what can be said is that the intelligence might have been very good at the beginning of the operations on the 7th of October, but obviously, over time, they've now depleted the target list to an extent where the Israelis don't have the targets anymore. They don't have the intelligence anymore to actually go after targets, and they're now guessing. And the other thing that we need to understand is that the target, the human intelligence, the signal intelligence that Israel had on the ground certainly doesn't apply to the intelligence they have underground. So there are two different battlefields here, and that's what people don't understand. There's a battlefield overground, and there's a battlefield underground that nobody knows about, and that is not necessarily connected to the battlefield overground. So that makes it so difficult for intelligence to become conclusive, and it seems that the Israelis are just doing what they see fit because nobody is holding them to account.
Yeah, you talked about the battlefield there, and we've shown the map of where the fighting is happening right now. What is ultimately the goal for the Israelis in targeting Al-Shifa, for example? What is the military goal beyond Al-Shifa?
Well, the absurd strategic target or strategic endgame that the Israelis are driving here is saying they want to completely annihilate Hamas's infrastructure. Hamas is primarily obviously an idea. Resistance is an idea. It's a movement. But even if they wanted to annihilate the military capabilities, they would have to kill every single Hamas fighter. So they're going literally house by house, whether it's a civilian house, whether it's a dual-use house, whether it's a hospital or any other infrastructure. They're going house by house and clearing it and making sure that no fighters are in there. That is obviously obviously not just very disruptive, but is also somewhat counterproductive, because you're basically being pulled into firefights potentially, and you're killing more civilians, which again is something that you're trying to avoid if you fight an insurgency. So I think it's part of that. Just let's clear everything. Let's try to provide evidence, and let's make sure that on the ground, at least, we're seizing and holding the ground. That's the kind of IDF approach. And that's going to take obviously ages. And that means you have to clear every single building, whether they're government buildings or hospitals.
Andreas, very good to get your insight about this. Andreas Krieg from King's College London joining us on the News Hour. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.